There was a heated debate in Parliament all day long over whether the One Nation, One Poll bill is violative of the federal nature of our constitution and whether this is an affront to the basic structure enshrined in the constitution. Joining us now on this broadcast live and exclusive is one of India's top constitutional experts, Harish Salve. He was also a member of the Ram Nath Kovind Committee on One Nation, One Poll, and therefore has had a lot of opportunity to apply his mind to the debate that's playing itself out. Mr. Salve, welcome and thank you for your time. I want to start by taking you through some of the objections raised by members of parliament from the opposition and get you to try and reply to the legal political debate that's playing itself out. Manish Tiwari from the Congress argues that this bill is violative of the federal structure of our constitution. It goes against the basic structure enshrined in the constitution, and essentially arguing that the parliament is not competent to try and push forth the 129th Constitution Amendment Bill. How do you respond to this very fundamental premise, Mr. Salve?
I have a serious problem as a lawyer. I cannot reply in WhatsApp or Twitter language. It violates the principle of federalism. It's a nice catchphrase. Why does it violate the principle of federalism? Can you articulate what is your understanding of the principle of federalism? The principle of federalism is Indian Constitution. You have a duality of legislative fields. You have the union list, you have the state list. The union is governed by a parliament, and the Rajya Sabha, the states have a house, and they are independent governments. They are elected. They are elected by themselves. The union has a constitution. We are not a pure federation like the US. There are certain areas where the UN has dominant roles to play. Now, that's broadly Indian federalism. Now, I don't know if coordinating elections or leaving them apart violates federalism. What will happen? The states will become subservient to the union if elections are held together. If the election is held on the same day, a state is inferior. If the election is held 6 months later, the state is superior. So this is a good debate on Twitter. But if you want a serious answer, the point very simply is this. And the report articulates reasons. Please challenge those reasons. Nobody is claiming to be an intellectual czar and saying what we have said is right in the report. The report says that if you read, and if you get into the tall grass with this, if you read the provisions of the Constitution, our Constitution very consciously says the term of Parliament shall not be more than. It doesn't say less than. And the same language is used for the state assemblies. What is the broad connotation of this law? This is only saying if Parliament or the state legislature, both are treated on par, once you coordinate one election, once the election is held, the term will be 5 years. If it is dissolved in less than 5 years, the fresh election will be for the balance period. So the state will always be governed by people who are elected by the state. If making a state government fall in 3 years because of political instability doesn't destroy federalism, then saying that if you get elected for a balance period of 2 years, how will that destroy federalism? So, this is the trouble. People learn certain catchphrases and repeat them ad nauseum.
So let me try and frame the debate in a way that common people can understand, because we had Ram Nath Kovind ji, the president of this committee, with us at Agenda Aaj Tak over the weekend, and he said that there is no need for the government to seek the approval of state assemblies if we're talking only about Lok Sabha polls and state assemblies. In the way that opposition parties see it, they're saying that this requires a 2/3 majority, not a simple majority in the floor of the House, and it requires at least half the state assemblies to ratify it. The government's position and the committee's position is that just a simple majority is enough to be able to push this through. How do you explain that?
Simple majority is a misnomer. Any constitution amendment requires 2/3 members present and voting. So you need that majority. It's not the consequential amendments which will be required to be made to the Representation of People Act will require a. But there are changes proposed to the constitution, which I can see you're running on your screen. Those changes will require an amendment of the constitution. The committee has taken the view, but this is not the last word of it. The committee has taken the view that this doesn't affect the states in a manner that it will require ratification of more than half the states. But if it does, it does. The point is, this thing has to be debated for its merits. And let me tell you a very important part of the committee which is not even being mentioned. Why did this report recommend this change? The cost of having elections is not the cost of an election. An election costs 3,000 crores or 5,000 crores. That's the price of democracy. But the cost of having elections is the cost of disruption. On an econometric model, it is 1% plus of GDP. You know what the Indian GDP is, you know how much money we are talking about. At the level of governance, it causes governmental paralysis, and we have seen that. Major policy decisions have to be put on hold. Look at what happened recently when Maharashtra elections were. Almost every important member of the union cabinet was there campaigning. Whenever in any big state elections are held, half the attention of the ruling party is in that state. It's the nature of the animal. That's how it has to be. So if we can have elections which are coordinated, and finally, and this is not in the report, this is my fantasy, someday, how do we address the scourge of money, unaccounted for money in elections? The government tried it once with electoral bonds in a judgment which someday of the Supreme Court will require careful analysis as to whether they got it right or wrong. I think the judgment is wrong. The Supreme Court struck down the electoral bonds. Ultimately, one solution could be partial public funding of elections. If you could have something like that, having one consolidated election will make that one step closer if there is someday a political will to do something like that. So if we rise above the politics of this and see the various other positives, that's the thing to be seen instead of start chucking catchphrases like, oh, it violates federalism and violates basic structure. If it violates federalism, it violates basic structure. So you're only repeating yourself.
So the opposition's contention is that one nation, one poll makes India a quasi-presidential system, and that there is excessive centralism and that it favors the government of the day, particularly if there's a strong leader and a strong party in power.
So let's just test it. If you are saying that there is a political advantage or disadvantage, I am not competent to comment because I don't understand politics. And I think this kind of a vote of no confidence against the intelligence of the Indian voter, who is repeatedly shown far greater political maturity than maybe the politician would want him to have, is something we can have faith in. But if elections are going to be held together or elections are going to be held apart, how does it make it presidential form of government? A presidential form of government is where the head of the executive is directly elected. Like in America, the president is directly elected in the sense that there is a presidential election by the electorate through the electoral colleges. How does this become a presidential form of government?
So the opposition's charge is that more national issues will prevail if voting takes place on one day. That there will be a predominance of national issues rather than localized, regional, state-wise issues if voting takes place on one day. That the national will subsume the regional.
I'm not. See, this is a vote of no confidence against the majority of the Indian voter. You think the Indian voter is so gullible that he will vote for a different person if it's a national election and a different person if it is a local election? I think the Indian politician must come to terms that the Indian voter has defied their wisdom every time. Whether it be an anticipation of winning a hell of a lot of seats or it's an anticipation somebody is going to lose very bad. We have seen the way elections have gone. You have seen the results at Lok Sabha, everybody was surprised. Now you've seen the results in Maharashtra where everybody is surprised. I think politicians better come to terms that the electorate is far wiser than what they would give it credit for. So, I think this kind of argument is not really, it doesn't wash with me, it may wash with somebody.
You made the argument that a lot of time is spent by top ministers for campaigning during state elections, and it takes away from the task of governance. The counter to that, Mr. Salve, is...
And model code is in place in large number of areas.
Sure. The counter to that is that frequent elections are also a safety valve in our democracy and a guardrail against excessive action by the central government. So when there's a very strong leader, if he's constantly tested and has to win the approval of people, he will be kept in check by popular impulse.
I'm not sure that's right. That's a point of view. I'm not sure that's right. But then if Constitution wanted it that way, it would have kept the parliament for 5 years and the term of the state assembly for 3 years to make sure that there are constant frequent elections. What happens if by accident some of the major states and the union go for election at the same time? Then this will not happen. Then does it mean that the center becomes overpowerful? So, today, let's just face it. Today, I think the ruling party is governing a bulk of the states. Tomorrow, if they decide to de facto coordinate elections, they dissolve those governments when the next parliamentary election is going to happen and coordinate all of them. Does it mean that it will change the balance of power in India? So, I don't buy this as a constitutional lawyer, because the Constitution did not have any such necessary disruptions anticipated. This is virtually like saying that although the term of a state assembly should be 5 years, you must keep disrupting it every now and then so that you go back to the people, so that the man is tested. I think this is in the teeth of the constitutional provision, this sort of a mindset.
I want to quote to you what Trinamool MP Kalyan Banerjee said during the debate. He argues that this bill infringes on the autonomy of state legislative assemblies, which are not subordinate to parliament. He argues that federal division of powers under the 7th schedule does not permit for the centre and for parliament to take a decision which impacts the term and tenure of the state assemblies without this being ratified by the state assemblies. Why did your committee reach the position that it did, and how do you legally justify that?
So this is not a matter of emotion. The Constitution defines which provisions cannot be effected. It says provisions where the Constitution confers powers on the state. If you are taking away the power of the state, for example, list 2, if you are making any change in list 2, or there are powers which the Constitution confers directly on states, if you are adding to or distracting or detracting from that power, you require. So that is what the Constitution requires. Here, the fundamental premise that it is a fundamental right of a state to continue for a period of 5 years in all circumstances, first of all, is contrary to the precept that you can only have an elected government in office. And that is the compelling federal principle. You can only have an elected government in office. You cannot continue an unpopular government. That's the heart of democracy. If that is true, then to say that you are taking away the right of the state is wrong. The state will have full 5 years. If it falls in between, it will get re-elected. Only that it will get re-elected for a lesser period. So,
But for it to be dissolved before its term gets over. Sir, let's assume this starts in 2029. There will be some elections that will be happening in 2027, for example, Uttar Pradesh, Gujarat. 2028 as well, especially in the earlier part of 2028, those will get dissolved before their 5 years gets over, against the wishes of the state assembly and against the wishes of the state government running that state assembly.
Yeah, so that will happen. First of all, that will happen only once. And secondly, that's if to achieve a larger and greater good. And secondly, to say that that takes away the right of a state assembly is plainly wrong. For the reason that the state assembly has no such indefeasible right to continue. What happens if the elected government falls? Then
no, when the law will be implemented at that time, most of these governments wouldn't have fallen. That's the argument the opposition is making.
So therefore, constitutionally, there is no constitutional guarantee that once you're elected, you will run for 5 years, come what may. If there is no such constitutional guarantee, the fundamental assumption is wrong. Yes, there will be one. You have to disrupt the system once to get it together for the rest of the life. of the Constitution. And that you are not doing as a regular feature. You are dissolving that one state once so that in the greater good, this all can continue for a long time.
So let's just zoom out for a moment and look at the larger issue of potential timelines. As a member of this Ram Nath Kovind Committee, by when do you see this being implemented? And many like S.Y. Qureshi, the former Chief Election Commissioner, has raised questions about the number of EVMs. That we simply don't have enough EVMs, VVPATs to be able to implement this at this moment. Yes.
Well, we consulted the current Election Commission and they said this can't be implemented in the next 3 to 5 years. Let's be clear, you have to lay down a full roadmap. So it's not that from 26 or 27 this is going to be put in place. So if you don't have the requisite number of EVMs, obviously it won't be done. I mean, this sort of an argument only suggests that somebody is in panic mode. Please see the detail and believe me, this cannot be rushed through and will not be rushed through. I'm sure there'll be a parliamentary committee constituted which will consider it in detail. It will knock it around. It may accept the formulation given by the committee. It may add to the formulations. It may detract from the formulations, or it may throw the whole thing out bag and baggage. The point is the time has come to start this debate. This is an important idea. Debate it. Maybe we hear some compelling arguments by which a view is taken that, well, the committee said so, but sorry, the committee, maybe the committee missed a point. So there is no, one should, this, what bothers me is when I see people getting up and thumping the table and say, oh, this violates federal structure, this violates this. Please, you've not even thought it through. You're shooting from the hip. These are matters of public debate. Please read the report carefully. Maybe you have some excellent objections to the report. Articulate them. Let it be debated in different public fora. Everybody, every Indian is a stakeholder in this. It's not only for the politicians. India is for Indians. People whose life gets disrupted. They also are stakeholders in making sure that their life doesn't get disrupted. People who have to wait for decisions because somebody has been deployed in election duty every 6 months are also stakeholders in this. So it's not just the political parties who are stakeholders in this. There needs to be a larger national debate, and I think the government will have to create a consensus of larger public opinion to get this.
So we've spoken about one nation, one poll. Since I have this opportunity, I want to use it to talk also about the legal debate around the Places of Worship Act. In a few weeks from now, the centre has to respond to the Supreme Court on whether the validity of the Places of Worship Act stands as it is. The BJP thinks this is an act of appeasement in general. Where do you come out on the Places of Worship Act, brought in after the demolition of the Babri?
I won't want to give an off-the-cuff opinion. I have read the arguments for and against. The reason I don't want to comment is I had appeared for the Gyanvapi Mosque plaintiffs in the Supreme Court. It does raise questions of moment. It does raise questions of moment. The Supreme Court will have to consider whether a law which says you will freeze everything the way it does is constitutionally permissible if it results in one particular community being denied to assert its right. I mean, there are strong arguments for and against, but I see the point in the challenge. It's very difficult. This is not such an open and shut case where I could, like many other people have, straight away from the hip say, oh yeah, this is plainly wrong. Plainly right.
So, former Chief Justice D.Y. Chandrachud's observation from 2022 has come in for a lot of criticism, where he says the Places of Worship Act does not prevent the determination of a structure's religious character as it was on the 15th of August 1947. What do you think of the kind of criticism the former Chief Justice is facing?
See, I don't know. This is the problem when judges speak in private forum. Judges should speak through their judgments. The argument is as follows, and I argued this for the Gyanvapi Mosque, and this is the matter to be considered. The submission is, the Act of 1947 says you will not change the religious structure, will not change the character of a religious structure from what it was on 15th August 1947. Now, if the argument is that there was a temple there where prayers were indeed being carried out, And if that is so, then there can never be a mosque on top of a temple as a matter of religion. So what you are really then arguing is that the real religious character of this structure was that of a temple, not of a mosque. And you may be right, you may be wrong. But it's not then you can't bring a jurisdictional challenge. That's what we argue. It's to be tested.
You said you didn't want to comment on the legality of this debate, and I respect that. But on the philosophical issue of whether a past dispute, which at this moment, Israeli and history books should be revived, and whether this is one of the challenges that India should spend its current energy focusing on, or should the focus be more on growth, investment, trade, employment, rather than reopening wounds of the past? Where do you come out on this philosophical question?
Speaking for myself, I'm not one who believes in public display of religion, though. And I come from a multicultural, multi-religious background. My mother was Hindu. I'm a baptized Christian. I'm married to a Muslim. And for us, religion is something which is something very personal. But having said that, you have to acknowledge there are people for whom this kind of a issue occupies front space. In a democracy, everybody is entitled to have his voice heard.
Okay. You don't want to delve much further into this. Hopefully, we'll have another opportunity. But thank you very much for joining us to talk about One Nation, One Poll, and for your comments on why people need to look at the larger picture of how this could help India rather than getting caught up on what you're calling catchphrases. Mr. Harish Salve, thank you for your time. Much appreciated.